Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video, what we're going to do is utilize the Go programming language in order to build a REST API. Now, this is not going to be a beginner-friendly tutorial, mainly because I am going to expect that you know the basics of the Go programming language. So as long as you know the basics of that, you should be able to take this tutorial and learn exactly how to build a REST API with Go. Now, it would also be nice if you are familiar with what exactly a REST API is. However, if you're not, that's a-okay because I'm going to do a quick explanation right now. So in the web world, there's really two different components that exist. We have the client and we have the server. So anytime that you go on a website, you go on a specific URL, what ends up happening is the client is going to make a request to the server to get some data. The server is then going to process that request and then return that data to the client. Once that's done, the client is going to render that data, and there you go, you can see all of your data. So for example, let's say I went ahead and went to a website where I'm storing all of my to-dos. So let's say I want to view all of my to-dos, so I go to the website. So what ends up happening is the client is going to make some sort of GET request with a path of the server URL / to-dos to this server. The server is going to look at this, look at the endpoint, and start executing logic to get all of our to-dos. And now once that's done, what ends up happening is it returns back an array of our to-dos. And it returns back our data in JSON format. So this right here is JSON format, and this is how clients and server interact with one another and communicate with one another. So another example, let's say we want to add and create a to-do. Well, what we can do is we can hit this exact same URL, but we can change this to a post request. This right here is the verb. Now what we want to do is we want to add a to-do. So the client needs to provide the server with information about the to-do itself. So right over here, it provides this JSON blob where we have a key that is item and then the property that is read book. As you can see, the communication is going both ways through JSON. And then the server can do something, it can add that to-do into the database, and then it can actually send back that JSON blob of the to-do that it added. So that is pretty much all it is that you need to know in terms of REST framework. One thing that is super important to understand is these verbs right over here, as well as how the client and the server ultimately communicate with one another. And that is through JSON. All right, so now that we got that started, let's actually go ahead and start working on our REST API. In this section, what we're going to do is go ahead and set up our Go application in order to build our REST API. So what I went ahead and did is I created this to-do-go directory, and inside of here I have this empty main.go file. Actually, it's not empty. The only thing that it has is this package main on line 1. So you go ahead and do the same. Now again, I'm opening this on VS Code. You can use whatever text editor you choose. However, VS Code is by far the most popular, and that is what I am going to be choosing. So in order to create a REST API, we're going to be utilizing a library called Gin, like so. So what we need to do is we need to somehow get this dependency inside of our main.go application. Now, in order to do this, what we need to do is set up dependency tracking inside of our Go app. So let's go ahead and first do that. So what we're going to need to do is open up our integrated terminal like so, and then right in here, we need to execute a very simple command. Go mod, and then over here, we're going to say init, and then over here, we're going to say example, and then we're going to do example / whatever directory we have right over here. So I'm going to say to-do-go. Now this is only going to work if you have Go installed on your local machine. Again, I do expect you to have it installed, being that you're taking this tutorial. So once this is executed, you should have this go.mod file. And now what we can do is we can download Gin onto our local Go application. In order to do this, we're going to do go get. And then what we need to do is we need to specify where we want to get this package from. This is going to be a GitHub package. So we're going to say GitHub dot, and then over here, we're going to say Gin gonic, and then /gin, like so. So go ahead, double check that you got everything right. Let's go ahead and download that. And now we should have, if you go over here, you can see here we have a bunch of different things going on. We also have this additional go.sum file. So that's pretty much all it is that we need to do to get started. So now what we can actually start doing is creating our API. The first thing that we need to do in order to create this API is to first define how our to-do data structure is going to look. And of course, in GoLang, we're going to do that with a struct. So over here, we're going to say type to-do, then we're going to say struct. And then over here, we're going to start defining the properties as well as the type of the values. So the first thing that we need to do is to have an ID in order to uniquely identify each to-do item. So we're going to say ID, and then over here, we're going to say that this is going to be of type string. All right. We're also going to have another property called item, and this also will be of type string. And then we're also going to have a completed status, and this is going to be of type Boolean. Okay, so now that we have created that, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to create a to-dos array. So let's go over here. We're going to say to-dos, and that's going to be equal to the type of to-do array. And over here, we are going to have a few different arrays. So let's have an ID of 1. Over here, we're going to say item of clean room. And then over here, we're also going to have a completed status of false, like so. So now let's just go ahead and copy this 3 times, or maybe just twice. Let's just change the ID to 2, change the ID to 3. And then over here, what we're going to do is we are going to also, let's say here, read book. And then over here, let's say record video, because that's what I do often. Now, one thing that I want to note is that this structure right over here is a completely different data structure than JSON. So why is that important? Well, let's remember that the client and the server communicate with one another through JSON, whether it is the client sending JSON to the server or the server sending JSON back to the client. So what we need to do is when the server decides to send data back to the client, we need to somehow get this data structure and convert it to JSON. Now, when the client is sending data to the server in the format of JSON, what we need to do is somehow get this JSON and convert it into a data structure that Go will understand. Now, this is actually a relatively easy thing to do. All we have to do is go to this struct, and then right over here, we can use these string literals, and then we can say JSON colon, and then over here, we can give this the property name inside of these quotes, and that's going to be ID like so. And that's really all it is that we need to do. So we're going to do JSON colon, and we're going to do title. And then over here, we're going to say JSON colon, and then we're going to do completed like so. So that is really all it is that we need to do. Now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and create our server. And surprisingly, this is going to be very, very simple. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to import a few packages. So the first package that we are going to import is one that is native to GoLang, which is going to be net HTTP. And then we're also going to import github.com/gin gonic/gin, so we can get gin working inside of our app. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create the main function that is going to run by default. And then right over here, in order to create our server, what we can do is we can assign a new variable called router, and that is going to be equal to gin.default. And that right there is going to create our server. So right here, this router is our server. Now, in order to run our server, all it is that we need to do is do a router.run. And then over here, we're going to specify the path. In this case, it's going to be localhost. And let's just make it 9090, just to be a little bit unique. So now our application, once we run it, of course, should be running on port 9090. Before we run our server, let's go ahead and create our very first endpoint. Now, in order to create an endpoint using this library, all we have to do is go right over here and then say router. And then over here, we're going to say the HTTP verb. This is going to be a GET request. We're going to say router.get. The first thing that we need to supply as a parameter is going to be the path that we're going to append to this URL. Over here, I'm going to say /todos, like so, because we want to get multiple to-dos for our very first endpoint. The second parameter is going to be a function that we're going to define inside of our main.go file, and that function is going to return that JSON data, and eventually this is going to be returned to the client. So let's go over here and let's define another function, and I'm going to call this function getTodos. So I'm going to say getTodos, and then over here it's going to take in one parameter, and we're going to call this parameter C, or we can even call it context, which I think would make a little bit more sense. So we're going to call this context, and this is going to be of type gin.context, like so. This context is going to contain a bunch of information about the incoming HTTP request. So inside of the HTTP request, we could have a bunch of information. We can have data inside of the request body, inside of the request header, etc. If we ever want to extract that data, all it is that we need to do is get that from the context. Okay, so that's all it is that we really need to do. Now, what we can actually do with the context is to actually transform that data that is in this data structure into JSON. And this is why we need this right over here, because this is going to be serving as a template. So what we can do here is we really just want to return this array of to-dos, but we need to convert it into JSON. So all it is that we have to do is context, and then over here we're going to say dot intended JSON, because this is going to convert this right over here, this data structure, into JSON. So over here, the first thing that we're going to supply it with is the status of our incoming request. So we're going to say over here HTTP, and this is going to be coming from a library that we are going to import. I thought we already imported it, I guess not. net/HTTP. So we're going to go ahead and import that. So we're going to say HTTP, and then over here we're going to say dot status. We're going to say status OK for this. And then the second parameter is going to be the JSON, or is going to be this data structure right over here. So we're going to say to-dos. And now, of course, what's going to happen is it's going to convert this data structure into JSON utilizing this. And this should be OK like so. So that's really all it is that we need to do. And that's pretty much it. So right over here, all we have to say is define that function that we want to call. That's going to be getTodos. Let's go ahead and save that. And now let's go ahead and run this application and try to hit this endpoint. In order to run our Go application, what we're going to do is we're going to open up our terminal, our integrated VS Code terminal, and we are going to execute go run main.go. And what this should do is run our Go application on this port. So now what we can do is we can actually try to hit this endpoint. So localhost :990/todos in order to get this data right over here. In order to do that, we can either do it inside of the browser or use a really cool tool called Postman. So I actually highly recommend that you go ahead and install Postman. It's a relatively easy download. I'll have the link in the description below. And then right over here, create a new folder. I created a new folder called GoLang. And then inside of here, I added a new request. And then over here, I put the URL as well as the path. And then I specified that this is going to be a GET request. If I were to send off this request, as you can see, we are getting back our data, our array of objects inside of JSON format. So we can see that this is working a-okay. Let us now create another endpoint that is going to allow us to add a to-do. So over here, I'm going to say function add to-do. And over here, we're going to similarly utilize the context. And now what it is that we need to do is create a new to-do. So let's go ahead and create a new variable that's going to be called new to-do. And we're going to give it the type of to-do. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the data from the client. So remember, in a post request, it's going to hit a specific endpoint, and the data for that specific to-do is going to be in a JSON format, and it's actually going to be inside of the request body. So how are we going to first extract that data from the request body and then convert it to this data structure that is familiar to GoLang? Well, this is actually not that difficult. All it is that we really need to do is utilize the context, and instead of utilizing intended JSON, we're going to utilize something called bind JSON. So over here, what I'm going to do is I am going to create a very new variable, and I'm going to call this error. And over here, we're going to say that that is going to be equal to, I'm going to say context dot bind JSON. So bind JSON like so. And then right in here, we're going to pass in this new to do. So over here, we're going to say and new to do like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do a colon. And then over here, we're going to say if the error is equal to nil, then what we want to do is we want to return. So what is happening right over here? Well, what's happening here is we're doing the context, and then we're going to be passing in the bind JSON. So context.bind JSON. And essentially what that means is it is going to take whatever JSON inside of our request body, and it's going to bind it to this new to-do that has this to-do type. Now, this potentially might return an error if our JSON doesn't have this format. So it doesn't have an ID that's a string, a title that's a string, as well as a completed that is a Boolean. So if that is the case, what's going to happen is it's going to throw an error. It's going to return an error. And over here, we're actually catching that error inside of this error variable right over here. Then what we're doing is we're checking, okay, if the error is not nil, because if everything is a-okay, well, it's just going to go ahead and bind that new to-do and not throw an error. So if it's not nil and we have an error, then this is actually going to go ahead and actually throw an error for us. And then we don't want to continue on and execute our code. So what we're going to do is just very simply return. So that is what's happening here. And now, well, we have this new to-do that we got from our JSON body. Okay? So now all it is that we need to do is we need to grab our to-dos array and then just very simply append all of the to-dos. And then we're going to append this new to-do onto it, like so. So new to-do. And then the last thing that we want to do is let's actually go ahead and return the new to-do. So over here, we're going to say context, and we're going to say this time dot intended JSON. We're going to say that the HTTP status is created. So status.created, like so. And then what we want to do is we want to convert this into JSON and return it. So that's pretty much all it is that we need to do. Now, all we have to say is router.post. We're going to also make this /todos. We could also make it /todo, but let's just keep it consistent. So /todos. And this one's going to be, what is this one going to be called? This one's going to be add to do like so. So now let's just go ahead and test this out. So what I'm going to do is I am going to exit out of this, run this again. Let's see if it's running. Okay. So let's go back to Postman. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new request. This one's going to be a post request. And this one's going to be to /todo. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to add anything in the request body. I'm going to send this off. And you can see here right away we're getting a 400 bad request error. Now let's go to the body. Let's go to raw like so. And then over here, we're going to supply it with some JSON. So we're going to say JSON ID. This one's going to be 1. And then over here, we're going to say the item that we want to do. We're going to say make bed. And then lastly, we're going to say completed. We're going to say that that is false. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and send that off. We get 201 created. And now if we send this request off, over here, you can see that, oh yeah, apologies. This should not be title. This should be item. So let's go over here. What did I do here? So let's go here. Do we have anything called, oh, like right here? This should be item. Apologies for that. You can see exactly why this is important because this is the mapping. So let's go over here. Let's try that again. We're going to say item now. And now if we were to make this request again, you can see we're still getting title, which is very strange. Oh yeah, that's because we need to restart our server. So let's go ahead and restart that. Control C and then go run main.go. So now if we make this request, initially we don't have our data. Now we're going to make this post request. There we go. We make this request and there we go. We have our new data. All right, that is cool and terrific. Let us now create a new endpoint that is going to allow us to get a specific to-do by the ID. So what I eventually want to do is if I want to get a specific to-do, all I want to do is I want to hit this get endpoint and then I'm going to do /todo and then /the to-do ID like so. And what this should do is just give us this object right over here rather than this whole array. So in order to do this, let's actually create a function that is going to iterate over this array and find the correct to-do with that specific ID. So over here, let's create this new function. So over here, I'm going to say get to-do by ID. And over here, this is going to take in the ID, which is going to be a string. Now, this is going to return the to-do as well as an error. So let's define that type over here. So it's going to return a to-do and an error. Now, it's really either going to return one or the other. So if it actually returns a to-do, then the error is going to be nil. However, if it returns an error, then the to-do is going to be nil. Okay, so all it is that we need to do here is very simply iterate through this array and then find a specific to-do. So over here, we're going to say for I. Then over here, we're going to say T for to-do is equal to range to-dos. And then over here, we're going to say if t.id is equal to the ID that we pass in right over here, then what we are going to do is very simply return to-do of I. And then the error is going to be nil. We're not going to have an error. So to-dos of I like so. Okay, so that's if we find it. However, if we don't find it, then we want to throw or return that we got no to-do, but we also want to return an error. So over here, what we're going to do is we're going to get this package called errors like so. And then over here, we're going to say, well, we want to return an error. So we're going to say errors dot new. And then here, we're just going to simply say to do not found, like so. So that is going to be the function. Now let's actually create the function that the handler is going to utilize. So over here, we're going to say func. We're going to say to do, or we're going to maybe call this get to do. Get to do like so. Now let's remember over here, this one was get to do's. This one's going to be get to do, one specific to do. This too is going to take in the context. So over here, we're going to get this context. We're going to pass that context in like so. And now the first thing that we need to do is somehow extract that dynamic ID from this URL. Now this is actually known as a path parameter. So somehow we need to extract that and get it from that URL. So how are we going to do that? Well, remember, all the information that we need is inside of the context. So all it is that we really need to do is just say that the ID is going to be :equal, and we're going to say context dot param, and then over here we're going to specify exactly what we want. Well, we want the ID. Now you might be thinking, where is this string coming from? Well, when we create this new endpoint, what we're going to do is we're going to say /todos, and then / to define that this is going to be dynamic, we're going to say /ID like so. And this is going to call the getToDo function. This right over here is going to be what the variable is going to be stored as. And as you can see here, we're going to say we want to get the ID. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So now what we can very simply do is call this function right over here, this getToDos by ID function. So over here, what we're going to do, and let's actually move this to the bottom because it makes more sense that way to have all of our route handlers here. And then over here, what we're going to do is we are going to say, so we're going to get the to do or the error, and that's going to be equal to equals, and then we're going to say get to do by ID. We're going to pass in the ID like so. Now over here, remember, we might either get a to do or an error. One of them is going to be nil. So let's just check if the error is not nil. Then what we want to do is we want to throw an error. So we're going to say if it is not nil, then what we want to do is we want to do context dot intended JSON. And then right in here, we're going to say HTTP. We're going to say status.notFound. So this is a not found error. And then we're also going to, let's actually supply it with a custom message. We can do that with gin.h. And then right in here, we can supply it with a custom message saying something like, we can say message. And then over here, we can say to do not found, like so. Okay, so that's really all it is that we need. The last thing that we can do if we actually, don't hit this if block, and over here, let's actually return. So if we don't hit this if block, then what we want to do is we actually want to return that very specific to do. So over here, we can just say that we want to return, or maybe we can just say c.intended JSON, or not c, context.intended JSON. And we're going to say that this is going to be equal to, we're going to say status. So let's say HTTP status. We're going to say that this is going to be status OK. And then we're also going to return that to do, like so. Okay, so that's pretty much all it is that we need to do. Let's just change this to capital like that. And there we go. So now let's go over here and let's try to make this request. Okay, the first thing we need to do is restart our server. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's restart it. Let's make this request again, and there we go. You can see that we are getting a specific item. So now the last thing that it is that we need to do is to very simply have the ability to update the completed status of a to-do. So let's do that in the next section. Let us now create a brand new endpoint that is going to allow us to update the status of a specific to-do. Now this is going to be a patch request because we are going to update something that is already existing. And in order to specifically identify what to-do we want to update, we're going to use these same parameters over here. So the same path parameters that we have right over here. So /todo /:id, except this is going to be a patch request. So let's just go ahead and copy this. And over here, we're going to change this to patch like so. And then over here, let's define a brand new function. So right here, we're going to say toggle to do status, something like that. And then over here, this is going to take in the context as usual, like so. Okay. And of course, we're not using Python here. This is going to be a function like so. Okay. So now that we got that, the first thing that we need to do is we need to extract the ID from the path parameter. We've actually already done that. The next thing that we need to do is we need to find the specific ID, the specific to-do by that ID. We actually already done that right over here with this function. So we can actually reuse this function. Now, if we don't have the to-do, if the to-do doesn't really exist, then we want to throw an error, which we actually did right over here. So what we can actually very simply do is copy this code and paste it in here. So now over here, we're getting the ID, we're getting the specific to-do by ID, and if the to-do doesn't exist, we're throwing an error. So if we don't hit this if block, then what we want to do is very simply convert or toggle the completed status. So what we're going to do is we're going to say to-do.completed is equal to exclamation mark to-do.completed. And so what this is going to do is it's going to flip the Boolean value. So if it was true, it's going to flip it to false. If it was false, it's going to flip it to true. So it's going to allow us to, well, toggle. The last thing that we need to do is send back that new to-do that we updated. So of course, we're going to do that with the context.intended JSON. And then over here, we're going to say HTTP status OK. And then over here, we're going to supply it with that new to-do. And that's pretty much all it is that we need to do. Now, right over here, what we're going to say is we're going to utilize the toggle to do status function. So let's go ahead into Postman. So the first thing what I'm going to do is, I always kind of forget to do this, but we need to run our server, restart and run our server. So I'm going to get this right now. Initially, it's false. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very simply change this to patch. I'm going to send this off, and now you can see that this is true. If I go ahead and try to get it now, you can see that it is still true. If I try to get all of them, you can see that this is the only one that is true. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go over here to /3 patch so I can change it back to a false. And you can see that the toggle is working fine. So now if I get the whole list, you can see that they're all false. So I hope you guys learned quite a lot. This was a really nice tutorial, a really good introduction to building REST APIs with Go. And I'll see you guys in the next one.